welcome to Flip the Script Core Session 2, Cold Calls, and how to have them in an easy, breezy, and strategic way that drives more pipeline. My name is Beck Holland. I'm the CEO and founder of Flip the Script. Before we get going into the material here, I want you to do me a favor. If you'd go ahead and download the deck so that you can follow along at each step of the way, because it's going to be a pretty meaty session today. So let's go ahead and get going. So first, why don't we start with a bit of an agenda? I feel like the weather woman. There are going to be two buckets to this session today. The first I wanted to start with is how to pick a reason for reaching out. I think a lot of people struggle here on what premise should I pick? Should this be personalized? Should this be relevant? How should we mix this together? So I wanted to go through basically a personalization infrastructure of all the different reasons that you could tease out about your prospect and how you can leverage that into a cold call. And then the second bucket, I'm going to go into a pretty lengthy bucket on how the entire comprehensive deck of how to have a cold call in a way, that gets your prospect to respond, feel heard, and want to take the meeting. So let's kick it off with picking a reason for outreach. When it comes to reaching out, again, like I mentioned, there are several different things that you could pick as your premise, but I think one of the low-hanging fruit for people is that usually when we're reaching out just to sell someone something. Right? So we need to shift that game and make it about the prospect in specific. So I've seen a lot of people, again, they are specific to the relevant buyer persona, or they say like, I'm here to tell you about our fancy product or all the things that we do and all the wonderful social proof that we have. But instead of talking about that, I want you first to refocus your game on how do I tease something out about this prospect that puts me apart from 99.9%, of the other sales reps in the industry, because I knew who they were before I'm talking to them. So if you're being paid by a company to call on someone, it's typically because they're a little bit higher up the value chain, if you will, in terms of hierarchy. So that's going to be a vice president or a head of or a director, someone TLDR who has spent a long time in their career. And so I'd always suggest going to their profile first and picking one specific thing that they did. So when they do pick up the phone and your heart starts racing, that you have something to say about them to disarm them, that you know them, so you're different than most of the reps that are giving them a call. So in terms of the buckets of premises that you can pick, I basically, whenever I was first deploying personalization and learning how to scale it, I said, what are all the reasons that I could personalize on when I was calling someone? So I lumped them into a big sheet of paper with a purple marker and started to understand common themes that these things had in common and put together a theory map of what I thought would cause conversion, and then tested that out with 3 different teams to understand which group and bucket of premises triggered the highest response rates, and then came up with the following map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with bucket 1. That should be the bucket that's going to cause you the highest amount of response rates from your prospects, wanting to take a meeting especially. And then I'm going to work my way backwards to buckets 4 and 5, which should cause the least amount of conversion. Still higher conversion than typical templates and typical cold calls without any personalization, but the lowest in the totem pole in terms of personalization. So why don't we start with bucket 1 and then we'll work our way backwards. Bucket 1 is going to be self-authored content. So this is going to be any kind of content that your prospect authored themselves. This is webinars, articles, posts that they've made on LinkedIn, and that's full disclosure where I'm sourcing all this material or all the stuff that they've authored. But whenever your prospect has done something or poured themselves into some piece of work, you want to, number one, validate that you have read the work, and you want to reaffirm that they did good in the work, with whatever they wrote or whatever they said, because it's super validating to your prospect. So after you watch this session, or after I finish recording this session, the number one thing that I'm going to be thinking, I want you to mentally guess in your head the one thing that I'm going to ask myself. If you guess that the number one thing that I'm going to be thinking after this session is I'm going to wonder whether this was relevant to you and whether you actually got help from the session, then you're correct. People are constantly wondering how they did. That's why when you take a picture with someone and someone else takes the picture, you want to go immediately to the camera and you want to check the photo, and you're not looking at anyone else. You're typically looking at how you look in the photo because you want to know how you performed. So when it comes to talking to our prospects, when you validate or you invalidate someone's work, it's stronger than invalidating them directly or to themselves. It's one of the strongest things that you can do whenever you're confirming that someone did well in their work. So if someone was a part of a webinar, if someone wrote an article or they made a post on LinkedIn, the first thing that they really want is engagement, because it's validation that what they said was really relevant to the target audience and that people liked it. So social media, by and large, is predicated on this premise that people want to see other people that enjoyed their work. So the first and strongest bucket, I've seen anywhere from 90 to 95% conversion when I'm using premises in this bucket. But that basically, it's going to get you the highest amount of conversion where your prospects know that when you reach out and you're using this on the cold call, that they feel like you know them, and so they're going to give you a little bit of time. As an asterisk mark, no matter what premise you pick, whether that's in bucket 1, 2, 3, or 15, you need to make sure that whatever premise you're picking is you can relate then back to your product. So you want to be very, very careful about what's called the 10-80-10 rule, where 10% is personalized, 80% is not personalized, and 10% is. It's a big no-no in the industry, because what that can look like is this. Hi, Beck. I noticed that you went to Texas A&M. We over here at Drift help website views turn into conversion into booked meetings. Give me a shot Wednesday at 10. Sounds like a great message, but the first thing the reader is wondering is, yes, I did go to Texas A&M. Me and 50,000 other people every single calendar year. So what's your point? So you want to make sure that whatever premise that you're picking out, whether that's in self-authored content or any of the other buckets, that you can then relate it back into what your product does. So be thinking through these premises in terms of that. The second bucket is going to be engaged content. This is going to be any content that your prospect engaged with on LinkedIn, but didn't directly author themselves. So I've got a few examples here, things that they liked, things that they shared, things that they commented on. But basically, this is going to be a list of things that they engaged with that someone else wrote. So not going to be quite as strong as bucket 1, because the hero, whenever you're reaching out and mentioning this work, is actually the person who authored it over the person who engaged with it. But it's still going to be relevant. It's going to be up there in terms of conversion. So whenever someone comments on something or likes something or shares something on social media, it actually is a confirmation of what they care about and who they are in terms of character. So think through whenever you like something on LinkedIn, what you're scared of liking and what you like right away. It's because it's a resume for you online of the kinds of things that you like and the kinds of things that you back in terms of principle. And so engaged content is a quick win, because it can show you what people care about. And so you can kind of back of the bar napkin math into what's relevant for them. So if I see one of my prospects is liking a lot of sales content, they're liking another trainer like Keenan. I love Keenan. Then I'd say like, oh, hey, notice, that you had this like on Keenan's post the other day about, being always being personalized or not liking BANT. What if you could ensure your reps over at Okta were not using BANT on the phone with your prospects, so that you can make sure that they're taking care of them from the front. So that's just kind of an example. But engaged content is going to be the second bucket. Again, not as high as the first in terms of conversion, but still very, very high up the chain with your prospects. The third bucket is going to be what I've coined self-identified traits. So what are self-identified traits? Self-identified traits are things that your prospect has written about themselves on LinkedIn. So whenever people started with LinkedIn back in the day, they were viewing LinkedIn as a resume. They were viewing it as a resume online that other people could look at so they could get a little bit of recognition. So that was the genesis of the platform. It has now morphed into something quite different, where people, personal brand, and people share content that's relevant to them, and they start understanding what's going on in the industry, and they even start marketing on LinkedIn with marketing solutions or talent solutions and finding jobs. There's several different, traits to LinkedIn at this point in the game. But back in the day, whenever it just started, that's how people were viewing it, is I want to find a way, almost like a business Facebook, of like, I want to find a way to put my resume online so that other people can see it in case they wanted to hire me, work with me, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever they set up their LinkedIn profile, or whenever I did, the first thing that LinkedIn asks you for is basically for you to fill out your profile. So part of filling out your profile is going to be filling out the profile line, headline, and the company line, but basically feeding LinkedIn information about your resume so that you can come across the right way to prospects. So typically people are going to have an about section. They're going to have one of these three things. The difference being headline is going to be the first thing that you see under their name. So even people are advertising in there at this point, but sometimes it's not just straightforward like the role. They'll say like increasing revenue with sales engagement for outreach, for instance. You'll see that under, instead of their title, it's some kind of tagline. But that's going to be the headline. The profile line is going to be the about section on LinkedIn. And then the company line is going to be sometimes, for instance, I just came from Chorus. That was the most recent organization that I worked with. And sometimes under the Chorus line, instead of talking about Chorus AI in specific, people will talk about what they did at that company, right? So these are 3 sources of information where people talk about what they care about, their expertise, or where they excel, that you can then tease out those words and use their own words to your advantage. So if someone communicates to you in their about section that they really like being strategic about, accounting or scaling effective teams, that's a low-hanging fruit to say, you said this thing. This is something that you're interested in. And so it's a good way to caveat and say like, okay, what if you could do X, Y, and Z more quickly? Or, I imagine that part of this is, congruent with this. And what if you could do this more quickly? But this is a good source of information that you can get to know your prospects really well. The 4th bucket, if you can't find anything in buckets 1, 2, or 3, typically I'm looking for my reps to hunt. I'm pushing them to hunt 80 to 85% of their premises in buckets 1, 2, and 3. I mean, I know all of this is going to be a little trickier than just sending out a mass blast template. I know that a template feels really good, but if they can't find in buckets 1, 2, or 3, the reason I'm pushing them into those buckets is because that's where they're going to see the most conversion. But if you can't find anything in those first buckets, 1, 2, or 3, they haven't done any activity on LinkedIn, they haven't liked anything, shared anything, made any posts, or written anything about themselves that you can then relate back, then I then move on to bucket 4. So bucket 4 is going to be what I affectionately call the junk drawer. The junk drawer is basically a list of premises that typically aren't all of that business related, but they're still about the person proper. So we're looking for a full circle profile at this point on LinkedIn whenever we're trying to hire someone. Sometimes we even check their social media in terms of Facebook, Instagram to get a full picture of who they are, because that's the person that we're really hiring is the full person. So the junk drawer is going to be a litany of things about someone that's on LinkedIn that isn't directly related to the job function. So, a couple of good examples here: schools attended, personal interests, hobbies, recommendations, or skill endorsements. But basically, these are all of the kind of niche topics about what makes someone someone. So for instance, I have on my profile that I went to Texas A&M, that I worked with a couple of different organizations internationally. I've actually never admitted that on camera, but I've worked with a couple of different organizations internationally, that I speak a couple of different languages, but I'm giving you a source of information of the things that I'm interested in that I would like for people to talk to me about one day, in Spanish, by the way. Just kidding. I don't speak it that well. Anywho, junk drawer. So you want to find these things about your prospects. And again, if you're going to go into bucket 4, you want to search for some kind of premise that you can then relate back to your product. So be very, very careful of the 10-80-10. I think it's worth repeating. Don't say, "Hi, Beck, I noticed you went to Texas A&M. We over here at Drift help with conversion." You want to say, if you pick, "Hi, Beck, you went to Texas A&M, then you better be able to relate, how that relates to your product. So I'm never going to tell anyone how to do the hook or what to say, but those are the rules of engagement that I've given to my reps in the past that ensures that they're successful. If I can't find anything in buckets 1 through 4, so no self-authored content, no engaged content, no self-identified traits, no junk drawer, then I then move into bucket 5, which is going to be company level data. So company level data is going to be anything about the company they work for, but not specifically about them. It's not nearly as strong as the first 4, because the first 4 buckets is about Scott in specific versus outreach. But if I can't find anything about Scott and Barker in specific, then I'm going to go on to company level data. So, anything from M&A, merger and acquisition, posts, blogs, hiring, website language, whatever matters to you. My biggest suggestion here would be to spit some kind of detail in the cold call intro, or some kind of, relevant fact that helps your prospect know that you're just not generically calling. So a lot of us in the industry, we value personalization, but the one thing that we're worried about is speed, right? So how many dials can we make with this, or how many emails can we send? So because of that concern, a lot of people, which I go into personalization at scale in another session of how to scale it, but because of that concern, a lot of people have tried to create templates that they can send to multiple people, or a cold call script that they can say to thousands of people, but make it look and feel personalized because they know that they value personalization, but they don't want to take the time to do it, and they want to be able to scale it. So because of that, you will see a lot of templates in the industry that quote unquote look personalized that aren't truly personalized. The wonderful thing about our prospects, and the wonderful thing about people that are within these significant organizations that have done all of these amazing things, is they're smart. You can tell, typically, at least I'll speak for myself and the people that I've worked with, you can tell if something is real or not. You can tell if this person actually knows you, and you can tell if they are genuinely talking to you, or if they're talking to a group of a massive amount of people. So I've even sent out templates before that said, like, I notice that your company is growing, and I could kick it out to 500 people. And I've had people respond and say, like, actually, my company has decreased in size in X, Y, and Z. But point being, you can usually tell if there's a genuine fabric to this personalization. And so if you're going to do the company level data, again, it's where you're going to see, at least in my experience, the least amount of conversion. However, I would focus on giving one detail about that company in specific, one quote from their website, one, quote from the posts that they're making or blogs that they're doing, but basically some detail in specific that helps them understand that you're talking to them, or you're talking to anyone who worked at Drift in specific, and not just anyone in the industry. So you're, again, not different than most of the sales reps that are reaching out. So now let's go into how to tie those together. So what I do here is what I call premise pairing. So essentially, if you have a postbound premise, a postbound premise is going to be anything that is related to marketing that they took an action in regards to your company, but it's not specifically about them. So think that inbound is demo requests and chat box like Drift or Intercom. Outbound is the person doesn't know you at all. And postbound is everything in between. So content downloads, webinar registrants, event attendees, high value MQLs for anyone who knows all the jargon. But basically, if you have a postbound premise, like this person did download a piece of your content, let's say, and those leads are going to the outbound team, let's say, then I would say, hi Scott, reason for my outreach is I noticed that you downloaded, effective cold calling habits, but more importantly, and you want to make it about your prospect and pick out a personalized summary. So, you want to give this for some kind of couching of this postbound premise of like, hey, the first reason for my outreach is I noticed that you attended this webinar on cold calling. But more importantly, I don't want to talk about me. I don't want to talk about how awesome the webinar was or how great, I think my company is. More importantly, I want to talk about you. You. So if you're going to mention this, and I would suggest mentioning it for couching, I would say, I noticed that you downloaded this content. I noticed that you went to this webinar. But more importantly, I saw that you wrote this article on LinkedIn where you're talking about scaling effective teams. And so I was curious to know, if you've come across us before. So again, you can mention both for flavor, transition with the words more importantly, and you should be in the clear. If you don't have a postbound premise, let's say this is just a cold outbound sequence. You want to basically bring up a personalized premise summary and also some kind of excerpt. So you want to give some kind of detail to that piece of content. So there's been a lot of people out there who list some kind of title of like, hey, I noticed that you wrote this article, and then they kind of leave it at that, and they haven't actually read the article. So we're thinking about speed very, very consistently whenever we're within an organization. And so a lot of people haven't taken the time to read the actual article and tease out some kind of excerpt. So you really want to drill home of like, I did read this article, and I can even prove it to you because I have one line that really gripped me. And whenever you quote someone back to that person, it's really, really powerful because you know that they said something that hit you at their core and resonated. So you want to give that not only the session title or the article title or, the post title or some kind of summary of what's going on. Even if you're doing the self-identified traits at the about section, I'd say, hi Beck, I'll do my profile, for instance. Hi Beck, I noticed it on your profile. You say that hiring the right homegrown Texan that innately believes that hiring the right people is just as important as developing them. You pair the summary with the excerpt of, hi, I notice, you have this about section where you talk about developing people. One quote that stood out to me is hiring the right people is just as important as developing people. So I was curious to know if you've come across our organization. But high level, you get it. If you've got the postbound premise, say it, but more importantly, and transition to personalization. If you don't have one, then I would start with the personalized premise summary, say one line in specific, and then give them some kind of quote where you're quoting them back to them. So here's an exhaustive list of sequences that you can build, and we'll get on to the cold calling in just a second. But here's an exhaustive list of sequences that you can build. In bucket 1 is where you can mention the premise in the cold call intro, and you'll see where this fits in a second. And bucket 2, where I wouldn't mention the premise for the cold call intro. So quick tip and example is company funding. See a lot of people reaching out because a company raises money, and that's a very important variable to them. It means that they have more money to buy my product, but that doesn't necessarily matter to that person, right? So they do have money, but you still need to focus on them and something they've done or said to really trigger the conversion. So this is an exhaustive list, but I go more into that in the session on how to build a sequence with personalization. So let's jump into the structuring a cold call. Now that we know how to tease out a premise, we have the data, we have the information and the meat, so we can deploy a seamless cold call. So let's go into the structure of it. So here's the structure. I hope that you've downloaded the deck. If you haven't, go to either flipthescript.co and download the deck, or if you're already on the website, go ahead and hit download so that you can follow along during this entire session. But basically, the first thing that you want to do on the cold call is you want to say, hey, let's say the prospect's name is Tom. Hi, Tom, this is Beck, calling with, let's use my former organization, Chorus, for instance. Hi, Tom, this is Beck calling from Chorus on a recorded line with Chorus AI. How have you been? You want to use how have you been because how are you is going to trigger pattern recognition within your prospect. Your prospects are trying to fit you into a box. They are in fight or flight mode whenever they pick up that cold call. And so they don't know if this is someone they know. They don't know if this is someone that they don't know, someone who wants something, someone who just called to, chat. They don't know if this is their brother calling on some random line, that isn't typical that he calls from and not from his cell phone, or they don't know if this is someone who's cold calling them. So they are in a really high peak disqualifying time whenever they pick up that phone. So these first seconds are really, really crucial. So you kind of want to do a little bit of a pattern interrupt of saying, hey, Tom, this is Beck calling on a recorded line with Chorus AI. How have you been? Because instead of saying, how are you communicates to your prospect, like, I don't know you. And I'm, without being genuine, I'm asking you, how are you? Because, I really just want to sell you something. If you say, how have you been? Then it triggers to your prospect, like, oh, I do know this person. I just can't remember or place them where I've met them or what they want. So it gives them a little bit of breathing room, kind of like a hiccup room, an air bubble, to where they're trying to figure it out. And by that point, whenever they say, good, who is this? And you say, that's a great question. If they ask you any kind of question at that point, my suggestion and my personal experience is that you should say, that's a great question. And then pivot to, the reason for my outreach is, and go into your personalization. And let me tell you the reasoning of why. A lot of people would argue with me and say, like, hey, you should answer their question. But the problem with that is you have just done an insatiable amount of research on your prospect. You know who they are. And if you start answering their question without personalizing, they still are wondering the question of whether you know them. So you'll always want to say, like, hey, that is a great question. I want to get to that in a minute. Like, great question, but the reason for my outreach is I saw this article that you wrote on LinkedIn where you're talking about scaling effective teams. One line that stood out to me was, it all comes down to great conversations. So I was curious to know if you've come across my company, I was curious to know if you've come across Chorus before. So at that point, your prospect knows one thing. They don't necessarily know you, but they know that you know them, right? So they're willing to give you a little bit of time. So when I started putting this personalization in, my cold calls went from, okay, I'm going to have to rattle off all these value props and then hang up the phone, to, oh, this person at least knows who I am. So they'll say, good, how are you? The responses just change because they get to know that I know who they are in specific. So again, from the top, that's going to go, why don't I use Outreach? Pretend that I work at Outreach. I'm a big fan of their company if you haven't checked them out. But let's pretend that I work at Outreach for a second. So I'd say, hi, Tom, this is Beck calling on a recorded line with Outreach. How have you been? And then Tom would say, like, good, this is Beck calling on a recorded line with who? And I'd say, that's a great question. Reason for my outreach is I was on your LinkedIn profile today and I saw that you wrote this article where you're talking about scaling effective teams. And one line that really struck me is you said, it all comes down to scaling great conversations. So I was curious to know if you've come across Outreach before. At this point in the call, your prospect is going to say one of two things. You guessed it, yes or no. If your prospect says yes, if your prospect has heard of you and they haven't bought your product, you need to go into in a very, very great tone and a very, very curious ego state of what they think. So if they say, yeah, I actually have heard of Outreach before, I wouldn't make the pitch of like, I'm going to go in and try and close the deal and get the meeting. I would say, oh, great. Be human. Be a real person. I would encourage you to be creative and be yourself and have a genuine conversation with someone where you're after curiosity and their experience over selling your product without an agenda. So if they say, yeah, I have heard of Outreach, I'd say, great, I hope that's good. What's your experience? And they'd say, oh, well, I ran into you at some kind of conference. I went up to your booth and da-da-da. I would start asking questions of like, what were you at the conference for? Did you enjoy the conference? What was the takeaway that you had? But get to know your prospect at this point. You're in conversation mode. You have now exited the toxic buyer and seller mentality where they're seeing you as a seller and they're the buyer so they can do those kind of things to you. You have now entered into rapport building mode where you are a friend to them and you are a little bit off record. So if anyone questions whether we treat people differently as a buyer and a seller as we do someone who's on the street, I want you to think through for a minute who you are whenever you drive a car. And is that a different state of you than whenever you see someone walking up to the restaurant? I'll never forget that there was one point where I had cut someone off in traffic and then I had pulled over into a restaurant. And they pulled over into the same restaurant, not because they were mad, but because they were going there. And then I went up to the door and saw them, and I held open the door for them. One girl was willing to cut them off because they were a bad person in traffic. The next girl was willing to hold the door open for them because I was seeing them face to face. So there's different rules of every conversation. So whenever you are a cold caller and you are in buyer-seller mentality, then someone is willing to hang up the phone on you to see you as a salesperson. So if someone says like, yes, I actually have heard of Outreach, you want to immediately exit with them the buyer-seller mentality and say like, okay, how was your experience? Why were you at the conference? What was the takeaway, etc. And you're now into curiosity mode where you're understanding what do they think of your company? Have they considered, ultimately buying your software? And if not, why? And what is all the details and background for that information? Because what you're after in this conversation is not jamming a meeting down anyone's throat, but getting to know your buyer more, because ultimately that will lead to more close-won deals. But now let's pretend that I say, so I was curious to know if you've come across Outreach before, and my prospect says, no, I haven't. I would say, got it. I would then launch into what I call a prospect pact. So now you've introduced yourself to your prospect and they know that you know them through some reason of personalization, and you know that they don't know your product or whatever that you sell. So now you're going to basically ask for permission to pitch your product. Before you think that I'm insane, hear me out for a second. People don't love surprises. That's why we don't like walking around corners. That's by and large. That's why we don't like walking around corners. It's why we don't like the dark. It's because we don't want something popping out at us that we don't know what it is. And your prospects are no different whenever they pick up the phone. Again, they're going to be in fight or flight mode and wonder who you are and what you want and whether they should stay on the line. And so at this point, instead of going off and rattling off all the wonderful things that your product does and who you are and how much money you have based on, which VC companies and all the social proof that you have and speeding up the pace, you want to make sure that you ask your prospect for permission to pitch. So essentially how I do that is by what I call a prospect pact. A prospect pact is a pact with your prospect where you're basically outlining the rules of engagement of what is going to happen so that we're all on the same page whenever you do go ahead and pitch. So then you can slow down your tone, you can take your time, you can give relevant examples because you just asked them for permission to pitch and they just allowed you to do it. So they can't net be mad at you whenever you do. So the first prospect pact that we're going to talk about is going to be an elevator pitch. I'm going to give you another option in a second. But, the generic term, the elevator pitch, basically means when you go into an elevator with your prospect, what is it that you say within that 45 seconds or 1 minute or, 20 seconds, however long it takes you to get to the next floor, that communicates what your product does so that the person might have interest. So the prospect pact with the elevator pitch goes like this. There are 4 different pieces to it. The first piece, you're going to ask or talk about the commitment that you're requiring from your prospect in this pact. So in this example, we're going to use the line, how about this? You give me the next 20 seconds. So the commitment is the 20 seconds that they're going to give you. Part 2 is going to be an agenda where you're going to set the agenda of what's going to happen in that 20 seconds. So there are no surprises jumping out of the box to your prospect. So in this example, we're going to say to give you my best dog and pony show on who Outreach is and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at Okta. So again, that's an agenda of what's going to happen in that 20 seconds. The third piece that you're going to talk about with your prospect is the outcome of that 20 seconds. So at the end of that 20 seconds, you tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there. So again, you're going to outline some kind of outcome that's typical that will happen after the prospect pact is finished and after you've given your 20 seconds in your elevator pitch. But you're basically going to give them the outcome of what's going to happen within that pact. And then the fourth piece is you're going to ask for good old consent. With the word that we're going to use today is deal. Another option that we'll go into later is sounds good. But basically, you want to look for some kind of permission-based consent with your prospect that you're allowed to go ahead and pitch your product. So again, the 4 pieces: commitment, agenda, outcome, and consent. And how that sounds like from the top is this. Got it. How about this? You give me the next 20 seconds to give you my best dog and pony show on who Outreach is and why I thought we might be a good fit for you and your team over at Okta. And at the end of that 20 seconds, you can tell me whether it makes sense to continue the conversation from there. Is that a deal? So basically, you're asking for some kind of bartering agreement where you say, you give me 20 seconds, and then you can tell me to go away. You give me, very like, hey mom, you let me go over to Cindy's house and I will clean my, room for a month, or I will do laundry for a couple of weeks. So it's some kind of bartering relationship where you're saying, if you give me your time and have the consensus to know that they are giving you their time, in fact, which is the number one asset for people. If you give me these 20 seconds and this time, then I promise, we can part ways if it's not a fit. So you basically have that barter relationship going with them. So, I would be less concerned with the wording here and more concerned or focused on, from your perspective, the technique of it. So you can kind of switch words in and out so that it sounds organic and it makes it sound like you. Because I think, if you're nervous, then your prospects can tell. So you always want to strive to be human and have creativity, etc. So I'm less concerned about the actual wording, but this is a great example of a prospect pack for the elevator pitch. My experience here, at least with the last 4 teams that I've worked with, is you're going to have anywhere from 90 to 95% conversion on this piece of the cold call. So when you typically have the respect to ask your prospect for permission, even to pitch, they're going to give it to you. And next slide. By the way, this clicker is super legit for anyone who's watching. I know you guys probably don't care and just want me to keep going, but it's a really nice clicker. Anywho, let's talk about the meat of that elevator pitch, y'all. So the beginning of the elevator pitch, you want to basically remember to tie in the personalization to your relevance. So keys to the kingdom is personalization without relevance, and they like you, but they basically don't want to work with you because they don't know if you can help them. Relevance without personalization. Some will buy from you, but you're not very different. So the keys to the kingdom is intertwining both. So you want to mention the first junction of the elevator pitch. Like I mentioned, I was really pulled in by this article that you wrote, and mention whatever premise that you picked in the beginning. Then you want to go on to the one thing that your buyer persona cares about. So typically, your buyer persona is going to care about one thing in specific. So I'll give you a great example. I was a sales development leader. So in my past life, like 2 weeks ago, when I was a sales development leader, the one thing that I cared about was meetings. But you want to caveat this piece of relevance, and the thing that they care about was saying a softening statement like, correct me if I'm wrong. So you don't want to be super authoritative with your prospect and basically tell them something that they're into, because then they slip into the child adaptive ego state, and they basically want to correct you or say that they don't like that thing. So there's something deep down in our humanity that wants to rebel, against something that someone tells us, especially if it's someone that we don't know. So I'll go into that later in a different session. But basically in this portion, you're trying to soften the blow, so to speak, so that they can kind of hear you out of the one thing that you think that matters to that buyer persona pain point. So there's a myriad of different ways that you can do this, but for today, let's just stick with correct me if I'm wrong and go from there. So you'd say, at the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, but VPs of sales development care about booked meetings. And you want to give your best shot on goal of the thing that you think that matters to them whenever they walk, home and in the door in the evening, and they're talking to their significant other about their day, and they say, how is this thing? It's the one thing that usually matters to them and typically threatens or enhances their job security. So like I mentioned, I was really pulled in by this article where you talk about scaling teams effectively and it all coming down to conversations. At the end of the day, correct me if I'm wrong, VPs of sales development care about booked meetings. And you want to cast at this point basically what I would call the horoscope net. Now, what's the horoscope net? A horoscope, whenever you read it within the on the newspaper or online, it basically gives you some kind of prediction of what's going to happen to you, and it always seems to be right to you and resonate with you to some degree. And the way that they do that to the masses is they basically pick three generic, or one or two or three generic things about someone that a lot of people fit into that subset. So, a great example is, so we work with VPs of sales development who want to book more meetings, but don't know what the reps are saying wrong on the phone that's preventing that from happening. So you typically want to cast this horoscope net for your prospect where you understand their worlds, and to where you are bumping up the likelihood that they agree with you, and something that you say they actually fit into in their mind. So you want to start with, so we work with, and put their role, we work with VPs of sales development and go into 3 pain points where you paint your prospect as the hero, not the villain. The hero and the victim, but not the villain. So you want to say, we work with VPs of sales development who want to book more meetings, but don't know what the reps are saying wrong on the phone that's preventing them from booking that meeting. Or they want to pull in more closed won revenue on the back end or influence ACV, but they don't know why their reps are hunting into the accounts that just aren't hitting home with their account executives. Or they want to take all of these SDRs into President's Club and promote them into account executives, but they just don't know how to get them to quota or where to coach them in a specific manner. And at the end of this horoscope net, you want to caveat out by saying, are you running into any of this in your day-to-day, or am I just rambling here? Now, the last portion is going to be very important where you say, am I just rambling here? Am I just rambling here is a bit of fall on your sword, self-deprecation language, whatever you want to call it. But you want to end with this because whenever you fall in front of someone, it's someone's natural instinct that they want to pick you up, right? So instead of saying, are you running into any of this day to day? Or another version of this I've heard is this relevant to you? Your prospect knows that they would be entering into what Chris Voss, the author of Never Split the Difference, would call a yes trap. So essentially a yes trap that he unpacks in that book is that when you ask someone a question that they know that if they answer yes to it, then they are trapped into being sold. So a great example of that is, I don't know if you've ever gotten a campaign that says, do you want to lose weight? Or do you want to be a billionaire and super successful and just like Jack Dorsey? And they're asking these kinds of questions that they know everyone will say yes to, because if that prospect says yes to it, then they can then sell into them. So your prospects, I mean, again, the great thing about them is they're really, really smart. They're bright. They've been through, the thing. They've done, this isn't their first rodeo. So if you ask a question like this, are you relevant? Or is this relevant to you? They actually will refrain from saying yes because they're scared, that if they do, then you're going to continue on and sell to them. So you want to caveat that with, or am I just rambling here? Because then instead of asking or answering, is this relevant to them? They're answering if you're rambling. So they'll typically say, you've fallen on your sword in front of them. They'll say, no, you're not just rambling. One of those pain points actually did matter to me, like that actually was pretty relevant to me in my day-to-day. So at that point, you want to be very specific and say which part, because you want to know the one thing about that monologue, that resonated with them, because then you can drill it home in the text, we'll cover a little bit later. That's the first prospect pact. But the second prospect pact that you can use is what I would call a 2-question failsafe. So again, there's 4 pieces to a prospect pact. It's the same as the first prospect pact in terms of structure. You've got commitment, you've got agenda, you've got outcome, and you want to ask for consent. But instead of asking for 20 seconds where you can give your elevator pitch, you want to ask for the ability or the permission to ask your prospect 2 questions. Full disclosure, this prospect pact is much harder to pull off, because then instead of having a buyer persona relevant 20-second commercial that's actually pretty similar in every case scenario, you have to ask 2 questions, and very hyper relevant questions that get your prospect to, talk a little bit more and see that there's relevance here. But when done well, the 2-question failsafe prospect pact is actually probably 4x the potency than the original prospect pact with the elevator pitch. So if I were you, and you haven't gotten into the habit of this yet, then I would start with this elevator pitch, and then I would then, once I had, really mastered that one, go into option 2, which is the 2-question failsafe. Another great time that you can use this prospect pact, the 2-question failsafe, is if your prospect is about to hang up the phone and you realize that in your bones, that you're like, this person's about to hang up, and it's kind of like a Hail Mary Mayday prospect pact of like, hey, before you go, and it goes like this. That's the commitment. The agenda is ask you 2 questions. So that's the agenda of what you're going to do in the prospect pact. The outcome is, and after those 2 questions, if I'm still not relevant to you and your team over at Okta, I promise my next call won't be unannounced. Does that sound good? So again, it's the same 4 pieces as the first prospect pact: commitment, agenda, outcome, and consent. It just sounds a little bit different, and you're asking for the ability or the permission to ask 2 questions as opposed to give your 20-second elevator pitch. So again, in review, that's going to be, let me ask you 2 questions, and after those 2 questions, if I'm still not relevant to you and your team over at Okta, then I promise my next call won't be unannounced. Does that sound good? So your prospect, again, is probably very, very likely, 90 to 95% chance in my experience, going to give you the ability to ask those 2 questions. So what do those 2 questions look like, and how can I nail them in a way that my prospect really knows that I bring value to the conversation? So the 2 questions go like this. Full disclosure, this infrastructure for the 2 questions actually came from my guy, Dan Smith from Winning by Design. Really, really great company. He's absolutely deadly as a trainer. So if you haven't looked him up, I would go look him up right now. But he gave me the beginnings of these 2 questions. So the 2 rules of the questions that I still use today is, number 1, the first question needs to be a closed situational question. Okay, so this is a question that is very finite about their business, and there is a dichotomous answer of like yes or no, or 34, or some level of detail where you're asking for a closed response, with a detail. A couple of things that I've added into here is, I would say you need to, in a best case scenario, you need to ask the question in a way that communicates to your prospect that you know their business to some degree. Number two, you need to ask a question. The second rule that I usually put for this for my teams is you cannot ask a question that you could have answered yourself without your prospect. Otherwise, you will give them some kind of feeling that you A, didn't do research, or B, that you have an agenda and you're trying to lead them down a certain path, which again, doesn't feel very good to your prospect. So, you don't want to give them the sense that you have an agenda in this question. You want to give them the sense and the feeling that you're truly asking this question out of curiosity, not that you're setting up some kind of Jenga or chess state that you're playing against your prospect. So the first question, I'm going to use, for instance, Chorus as a conversation intelligence platform for an example. The first question for a closed situational question that would include some level of detail is I would say, for example, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have 17 reps on your team, and you just added a new VP of sales. Out of those 17 reps, who's your top performer? So again, you provided some level of context that you know their business because they have 17 reps and just added a new VP of sales, and you asked a question of who is their top performer. So no amount of LinkedIn research or no amount of CRM data scrub or any kind of data provider is going to be able to provide you with the answer to that question. The answer to that question is very personal. And the answer to that question has to be sourced by the leader, someone who's internal, who would know who the top performer is. So again, you really want to hone in on some kind of question that you need them to answer. Otherwise, they'll feel like you have an agenda. So in review, I'd say, okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Looks like you have 17 reps on your team. You just added a VP of sales, and you just added a sales enablement person. So out of those 17 reps, who is your top performer? And they'll give you an answer. Linda. Linda's my top performer. Say, okay, great. Your second question needs to be an open pain question that gets your prospect to realize that there is some level of distance between where they are right now and where they would like to be in terms of information, in terms of enablement, that they have a problem that basically they are willing to self-uncover and talk about a little bit. So the open pain question, it needs to be any kind of question that is not finite. It's not situational. You're not asking them how big their team is or how long they've been a leader, but you're saying, some kind of question that will basically make them self-uncover that they have some level of distance between where they are currently and where they want to be in terms of information. So a great example in this case example was, correct me if I'm wrong, I noticed you have 17 reps over in your team and just added a VP of sales and director of sales enablement. Out of those 17 reps, who is your top performer? They'd say Linda. I'd say, got it. What is Linda doing differently in terms of cold calls from the rest of your team? So you'll hear, VPs of sales dev or VPs of sales go, I think, well, Linda's calling more. And, I think that she's calling more in the afternoons and she just always has that fire and da-da-da. And they'll kind of start to make this list of what they think their best guess is. But what I'm trying to illustrate with my prospect is that they really don't finitely know. They don't have the details to how Linda is tying a hook of personalization to relevance, what she's saying on the phone in terms of buyer persona, how is she deploying her cold calls in the beginning that's making her so successful. So I'm having the prospect in those 20 seconds self-uncover that there is a distance between where they want to be and where they are currently in terms of the information that they have, because that information would be valuable. Because if they knew what Linda was doing differently, then they could essentially turn all of their reps who are struggling to hit quota or struggling to get meetings or struggling to build rapport with their prospects to the same level as Linda is. I'll give you another great example just for illustration. So my first situational close question, if I'm selling some kind of conversation intelligence software, some kind of sales engagement software, is I would say, so correct me if I'm wrong, you've got 3 competitors, and I would name them. That's the bit of research. So for instance, I would say, okay, for CRM, I would say, okay, you've got Copper, you've got Salesforce, and you've got not so annoying CRM. Which one of those competitors do you worry about the most? They would say, I worry about Copper. I'd say, got it. So How are your best reps competitively differentiating from copper on the deals that you have closed won? So they would struggle for the information at this point. I think that they're saying, I don't know. I mean, maybe they're talking a little bit, not mudslinging as much, or maybe they're, I don't know, maybe pushing a little bit more aggressively, and they'll give their best guess, but they're self-uncovering in that 20 seconds that they really don't know the difference between what their rep is saying in a close won situation on average and what their rep is saying in a close loss situation. So there is a gap between those two situations. One, I win the deal, one, I don't win the deal, and it's a competitive deal, so it really hurts. So you want to make sure that your prospect, feels like they are answering, for the first question, again in review, a question that you couldn't have known the answer to without them. So you couldn't have known whether Salesforce, not so annoying CRM, or Copper was their biggest competitor. Which one was the one that they worry about the most? And then the second question, you want to ask them, when their reps are pitching competitive differentiators, once you have the answer to that question, Copper is our biggest competitor. Okay, great. So how are your reps pitching against Copper whenever they close won the deal versus close loss, to where the prospect then struggles with the information and starts to give some level of detail, but realizes and self-uncovers that they really don't know the answer to that question, and it's an insatiably valuable question for them to know the answer to. So in either case scenario, whether you want to play it a little bit safer with the elevator pitch prospect pact, or you want to have the temerity to do the 2-question failsafe prospect pact, in either case scenario, what you're looking for from your prospect is some kind of pain point. Prospects and people in general will buy for the release of pain and the relief of pain more than they will ever buy for pleasure. So let me tell you a little bit of a story. I was raised in the Dallas-Fort Worth area back in good old Texas, and I had 2 animals with me whenever I was growing up. I had a dog named Cow Cow, and I had a horse. Basically, still to this day, I still ride horses. So with the dog, I noticed that I was trying to train the dog through giving her treats. So I'd say sit, stay, fetch, etc. And whenever she did the action, I would reward her with a treat for positive reinforcement. And one day I was out riding the horse, and I grabbed a carrot to go give it to the horse. And my mom said something that I'll never forget. She said, "You don't train or teach a horse by giving the horse treats. You train the horse by the release of pressure." Essentially, the smarter the animal, discipline and more complex jumps is what trains the animal. So when it comes to your prospects, not that you're training them, full disclosure, but when it comes to your prospects, they're a really, really smart animal. So they are going to crave the release of pressure more than anything else in the world. So if your prospects are in business, if they have any kind of buyer persona, whether it's a CIO to a CMO to a CRO to an SDR to an account executive to a sales enablement leader, all of them have some type of pain, and all of them crave release from that pain and release from that pressure. So whenever you have a pain point, let's imagine that you did the first prospect pack with the elevator pitch, and they said, like you said, finish with, "Are you running into any of this in your day-to-day, or am I just rambling here?" And they say, "No, you're not just rambling. Actually, that does sound kind of relevant to me." And I would say, "Which part? What in specific did you run? What in specific hit home for you?" And they're going to give you one piece of information. At that point, you have the very, very valuable pain point. But at this point in the conversation, most reps make a little bit of a classic mistake. They hear a pain point, and all they're thinking is, my product relieves that pain point. So I'm going to start to pitch my product and everything that it does at this prospect because they just brought up the one thing that we alleviate. The problem with that is that the pain point isn't deep enough for them yet, and they haven't uncovered that in the conversation. So I always relate this to the movie Armageddon. In the movie Armageddon, basically, there is a big meteor that's coming for the planet Earth. And so NASA sends up a crew of oil drillers to basically drill into the meteor so they can drop a bomb and they can explode the meteor. And if the oil drillers don't hit a certain depth, then basically they'll, drop the bomb in the shallow part of the meteor and they'll blow off the surface, but they won't get it deep enough to where they can blow up the meteor to where it will blow up into 2 pieces and miss the planet Earth. So I want you to think of the same thing with your prospects. When your prospect gives you a pain point, instead of immediately pitching them all the wonderful things your product does and how it alleviates that pain point, I want you to view it as you have just cracked into the meteor. But you don't want to go ahead and drop the bomb by talking about your product because it'll just blow off the surface and not get you your goal. So you want to dig a little bit deeper into the details of that pain point to see what the specifics are for your prospect. Number one, so that you know the details, so that it can help you craft your pitch a little bit better if you were to ever pitch. But number two, so that you can have your prospect knows that you're listening to them, and that it gives the details behind the summary of the problem that's going on behind the curtain, so they're more likely to do something about it because they've developed that pain on the phone with you. There are 5 types of questions that you can ask within what I would call the pain pulse. There are 5 different ways to this pulse. You're going to start with questions that are not so deep, and then you're going to get into the meatier questions near the latter buckets of questions. But basically, you don't want to walk up to someone off the street and ask them, "Hey, nice to meet you. What's your deepest, darkest fear?" Or you don't want to see someone on a date and say, "Hey, can you tell me about your childhood and what you're afraid of going into your 30s?" You want to earn the right to ask those deeper questions by asking a little bit more shallow questions in the beginning, or ones that are coming up for a little bit more for air, so that someone can you can build trust with someone, build rapport with someone, so that you earn the right to ask those deeper questions. So the first bucket is going to be the most shallow. So the first wave of this pulse is going to be what I would call overview questions. So in these questions, these are basically very light questions where you are just asking about a general overview of the pain point from your prospect. So a couple of different examples are up here, but basically you just want to get them to talk about their story. So a great example is this. Whenever I'm interviewing someone, for instance, when I was a sales leader, I would say, first off, tell me about yourself. And I would let the person being interviewed take me wherever they wanted to take me. So I wouldn't give very many boundaries. I wouldn't give very many rules. I would just say, tell me about yourself, because I wanted that person to lead me immediately to what was important to them. Well, I just graduated from school and I've been looking for a role that does X, Y, and Z. Or I've been at a company, but I'm thinking about leaving for X, Y, and Z reasons. Or I just got laid off from my company and I'm looking for an opportunity where I can do this. But I basically want to let them have the reins within a certain amount of structure of like what's important to them and where do they want to lead me, because I want them to lead me to the most important spots, because I simply don't know what the important spots are at this point. So whenever your prospect says, that piece about not knowing where my reps are going wrong in terms of the words that they're saying over email rings a bell. I'd say, okay, what do you mean by that? It's a great example. Or you mean in regards to, and I'd get my prospect to keep talking. And really my goal at this point is genuine curiosity to understand what are they talking about with this pain point, and can I understand a little bit more? So I used to quiz my reps, and I think a really good tip for you at home is whenever you're talking to your prospects, you should be able to hang up the phone after that cold call, after you've talked to your prospect. And if you can't give a 30-second overview of what's going on in their business, what their team is set up like, and talk a little bit about their day-to-day, then you typically haven't been curious enough. So you should be able to give some level of story on what is going on with this person, because what you're really after is what is happening with them, what are they running into, how are they struggling, in what way are they struggling, how long are they struggling, but you should be able to give some kind of overview of all the things going on with them, because essentially that's the information that you need to understand if you're a fit, and if you are a fit, how you're a fit, right? So those are the things that you should crave on a cold call, and in this portion of the pain pulse, and during these waves, is that you want the information from your prospect of what's going on with them. So start with overview questions, keep it shallow, keep it light, and get them to lead you to where they're going. So they'd say, for instance, with the, my reps are struggling on cold calls. I say, what do you mean by that? Oh, well, I feel like they, sometimes they go into the buyer persona portion a little too early, and I hear them talking a little bit too long to my prospects and X, Y, and Z. At this point in the call, you can use what I would call situational questions, and that's the second bucket of questions. Situational questions, full disclosure, I put the wording here, but you want to use sparingly during this entire pain pulse. Situational questions are great for reference, but if overused, can make your prospect feel like they are being qualified, or make them feel like they are being sized up for whether you can sell into them and how much money you're going to make off the deal. So I hear this a lot on the phone with people calling, or cold callers calling into prospects, where they're basically asking all the questions that matter to them that would determine how lucrative the deal is, of like, what's your team size? What kind of CRM do you use? You know, how many different geos are you doing? How big of a team are you running? And they're asking these very finite questions because they're trying to understand, before they even know anything about really the organization, what are the details that matter to me so that I can understand how much effort I'm going to put into this. Sounds great in theory, but it's really hard on your prospects because they feel sized up and like you don't actually care about their business. You just care about what's in it for you. So you want to give them the reverse sensation that like you care about them regardless of whether there's something in it for you. You know, you care about their business and whether they're successful in their goals. So with situational questions, I put a couple here, you know, for a sales engagement software or for conversation intelligence is what I just came from. You know, these are just a couple examples. How many people are on your team? What CRM are you using? What team are you responsible for running? But again, you can use them for reference, but I would only use one at a time, never back to back. And I certainly wouldn't use an overwhelming amount of them, because net, they're not the highest value questions, because the highest value questions, whether we know it or not, are the ones that make our prospects feel heard, understood, and like you brought value to the table. The third wave to this pulse, or the third bucket of questions, is going to be open pain questions. So open pain questions, we talked about them a little bit on the slide before, but basically this is a question that opens up the floor to your prospect and gets them to talk about some kind of pain that they're having, to where they're going ungated and on you know, a longer end. So it's not just a dichotomous answer, it's something that's going on a little bit longer, and they're talking about a pain that they're running into. So this is the third wave to the pulse because it's a little bit deeper. So we've done overview questions and we've heard about their business. We've done a few situational questions, not too many, you know, where we're understanding what is going on in their business from the details perspective for the situational things happening in their business. And then the third bucket is we're going to go into open pain question based on those situational details that we've learned. So great couple of examples that are listed here, again, for a CI vendor. But what is your top rep doing differently? How are you pitching against competitors? What are the top 3 things you wish your reps weren't saying on calls? Again, you always want to focus on questions that you could not have known the answer to without talking to this person. Because if you ask a lot of questions that you could have known the answer to, number one, your prospects will think that you haven't done any research on them, because you shouldn't have to ask them how big their company is. You should know that because you're cold calling them, right? So you should have done the research to know what their business is doing. But number 2, in the worst case scenario, is they think they're being led down this path or trail to where you're ultimately going to close them. And you want to make your prospects feel you're a new person in the room. And you want to make them feel like you are their advocate, you are in their corner, and you're genuinely curious about what's going on in their day-to-day and how you can help, regardless on whether that makes you any money. That is the heart of good sales, is being an advocate for your prospects, regardless of the situation, and making sure that you can add value at each step of the way. The fourth wave to this pulse is going to be time frame questions. So I put one here, but basically after they're talking about all the pain that's going on in their organization, you want to get some kind of frame of reference for the timeline of how long this has been going on. This is just another quiver in your arrow in your quiver that you can use with your prospect to hunt business. But essentially, you just want to get a good marker at some point in the conversation for how long this pain has been going on, how long have they been dealing with it, because it will give you a good sense of the urgency that is driven within their organization, because the longer the pain, the more urgent the gain. I didn't mean to rhyme that phrase, but you know, maybe I should trademark it and print on a shirt or something. Just kidding. The fifth wave to this pulse, and these are into the deeper questions. Now we're talking about, you know, stuff that really, really matters to them. So this entire portion from top to bottom should be no longer on a cold call than 2 minutes. I'd say 2 minutes, you're in the sweet zone. 1.5 minutes is good enough, you know, but I'd say 2 minutes, like you're starting to hit the state of inflection point, if that makes any sense to at the point in the call of like, You want to hear people out. You want to understand about their business, but you also don't want to turn into a therapist where you're just talking to people for 15 or 20 minutes about their problems and not really advancing the call. So this fifth portion, or this fifth pulse to this pain, is basically you're talking, all about implication questions. So basically, in sections 1, 2, 3, and 4, especially section 3, where you're talking about the open pain, what are the implications to this person based on that pain? So if they don't know what their top reps are doing differently, or if they don't know how they're pitching it against competitors, what is the danger of that for your prospect? So the danger could be, for instance, that they can't get the reps to hit quota, or the people who are C players, they can't get to get any better. They can't coach them because they don't know what they're doing differently. They can't get them better because they don't know what the great reps are doing, right? So if I don't know what good is, how do I know how to improve these C players, right? If I don't know why, the starting quarterback is the starting quarterback and what they're doing, then how can I coach anyone else to do what they're doing, because I simply don't know? So these implication questions, you're digging in a little bit deeper. I'd say on a cold call, I very rarely get into this zone. Full disclosure, this entire pain pulse with all 5 waves are really designed for a longer conversation. However, I just want you guys to have an entire overview of all the kinds of questions that you can use with your prospects to really instigate a meaningful conversation. But again, I would say 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, because you don't want to turn into a therapist. I've been on a cold call once for 42 minutes, and the person had no company and worked for no company. So full disclosure, some people just like to talk. So you want to make sure that your prospect feels heard, that you really get a meaningful conversation, and then you want to tighten it up and close it out. What you're really after in any of this, and this is, I don't know if this is too honest on record, but usually someone cares about something much deeper than any of this even. It's not about the overview, and it's not about, the situational questions that they use Salesforce, or that they don't know what their reps are doing differently, or how long that's been going on, or even what's the impact to their team, or what's the impact, to their job. Usually there's one fear that people have behind the curtain. It's a deep, dark fear. I would never get into it on a cold call for sure. But I would say, I would pose the question for your prospects and in general, something to be cognizant of within these cold call is, what is the prospect's ultimate pain pith? Now, before you think that I'm just making words up, pith is defined as the origin, essence, core, or heart of something. So a pith is basically the motive behind anything significant. So a pith is usually going to be something of like, hey, maybe I'm worried about, in the former example, I'm worried about that I don't know what my reps are saying differently on the phone, because I don't know why my C players are C players, so I can't help coach them to get better, so that I can't get my team up to full quota attainment, so that I can't look good in front of my CEO or new CRO, and so that ultimately they're going to not think I'm valuable, and they're going to want to let go of me, especially during something like COVID or a pandemic, whenever they're cutting people. So that pith can be pretty deep for a lot of different people. And again, in no way do I necessarily suggest that you go into that in a cold call, but I'd say something to be cognizant of is there's usually one core motivator behind people. For VPs of sales, for instance, it's very, very typical that a VP of sales is churned. So I think the average metric is anywhere from 12 to 17 months on average. And so they're worried about getting their team up to quota. And so the pith might be, I just want to be really, really successful at my job and make sure I don't have a self-induced churn. So they're worried about all of these, more shallow items, within the meteor, but what they're really worried about is this. So I would keep that in mind when I'm talking to someone, is there is a core motivator behind everything. So I'll give you a great example, and then we can move on to the rest of the cold call. Flip the script for me is a very new adventure. I'd been doing this for a while. I taught it as an after-hour series over when I was at G2, and then I continued that on into Chorus whenever I was doing some YouTube videos, and then onto the tour. But it had been a constant motivator and a constant source of fulfillment for me. I was really, really excited every time I got to teach anything to any kind of rep, and it was something that made me super excited. So a pith for me, a core motivator, and something that was anchoring me was, what do I do with Flip the Script? So when I was evaluating all of my decisions, whether that was professionally or personally, or how much time do I do where, I found myself consistently evaluating them against what it would mean to flip the script. So some people that's a job, some people that is their family, some people that's a relationship. But I was anchoring myself to, this is the thing that's the most important to me right now in my life. And so I want to evaluate all of my other decisions based on what it does to flip the script. So there is a professional one for each person that you talk to of something that is anchoring them, that they take as a constant, and they are evaluating things that they do, whether they buy software, what geo they move, what kind of role that they take, etc., based on this one thing. And so I do think that it's worth noting that finding that thing for that person is extremely, extremely valuable. Because if you don't know that thing, their actions might come off a little, random or bizarre, or maybe you don't understand the meaning of why. Great example for flip the script is I really wanted to deliver free training to the front lines. I thought that this community deserved that. They were owed that at this point. And so I was trying to do everything I could to find a way, even if it was just me, and I'm not even the best, right? But I give away free training because I think that people deserve some kind of free training. So when I was evaluating how to monetize flip the script, or how to do flip the script, or how I was doing it at Chorus, etc., something that was always very, very important to me was that it was free, because individual contributors oftentimes don't hold the budget. So a couple of the decisions that people who didn't know that pith for me might have looked bizarre. So you need to find what that motivator is for your prospects so that you better understand their world. So let's talk about closing it out. So you've now had the intro, you've given your prospect pact, you've won the elevator pitch or the 2-question failsafe. They let you through to the pain pulse. You went through these questions, you understood more about your prospect. You've hit that minute and a half, that 2 minutes where they've been talking, for quite a while, and you understand what's going on in their business. I hope you were listening, full disclosure. And you hit what I would call the breath point. The breath point of a conversation is going to be the following. When you're eating a meal, at least again in my experience, I'm eating a meal and I get to this point in the meal where I take a breath. I say, and at that point, I make the decision of either number 1, to keep eating, or number 2, I'm satisfied within the meal. So I think everyone has that experience that you have run into that at some point or another. So when you're at the breath point of the conversation, where it's very natural that they have, talked a little bit about their business, giving you some information about what's relevant to them, and you've hit that point in the conversation where you're both taking a breath, that's the point where you want to start closing out the conversation. So we'll go through the following steps. I would start with using, only in this case, a little bit of what I would call wasted text. So wasted text in review is anything of like, just want to bubble this to the top of your inbox, just want to, follow up, just want to circle back, etc. Wasted text would be, in this case scenario, I know I called you unannounced. So instead of saying, I know you're busy, but at the beginning of a conversation, you're going to use it strategically after they have told you about their business. Because at this point, you understand enough about their business to where you think that you have a compelling case to have another meeting, about more about their team, etc. So you want to say, I know I called you unannounced, because you want to close down the conversation, especially for the people that want to talk quite a bit. This is a great way to not make them feel unheard or like they talk too long, but also kind of give them their time back and schedule the next call. Because the next call is where you want to go in deeper. The next call is where you want to talk more about their team. And their next call is where you want to uncover whether you're a fit and whether you can provide value to where you can ultimately sell your solution. So I would say, I know I called and announced. Do you have your calendar handy? And a lot of times you'll hear them say like, yeah, my calendar handy for what? I'd say, how does Tuesday at 2 look? And they'd say, Tuesday at 2 for what? In some case scenarios. Sometimes they'll say it looks great, but let's go worst case scenario. They say Tuesday at 2 for what? I'd say Tuesday at 2, let me repeat this back to you just to make sure that I'm getting all of this right. And you want to give them a summary of what they talked about in that pain pulse. Okay? So to quote the movie Hitch, whenever someone is talking, you want to listen to them. So you want to be able to give some level of detail of what they just shared with you, because being able to repeat something and teach something is more of a sign of understanding and listening than is shaking your head and saying, yes, I totally get it. So at this point, you want to give them a summary and say, let me repeat this back to you to make sure that I get it right. You have a team of 17 reps. You just hired a VP of sales and director of sales enablement. Congratulations, by the way. Linda's your top performer. You don't know what she's doing differently on the phone. You really want to get your C players to A players. You really want to, get more meetings, but you don't know what's holding your team back. Tuesday at 2, I want to hear more about that. So you basically want to say, let's go a little bit deeper on that. I'm not even going to talk about my product yet. Tuesday at 2, I want to hear more about that and understand a little bit more about your team. And then we can go in a little bit, if it makes sense. And if we do uncover that it's a fit, I can tell you a little bit more about outreach and how we might solve for some of those problems. So you want to give an agenda to your prospect of what that call is going to entail. You don't want to just say, Tuesday at 2, let's meet and go through my software. Tuesday at 2 needs to be all about your prospect, and you want to give them some kind of overlay of what the agenda is. Not quite done, but almost there, guys. Couple more slides. At the end of the call on Tuesday, you want to give them basically the outcome of what's going to happen on Tuesday at 2. So again, your prospects don't like going around the corner because it's scary and they don't know what it is. So you need to not only give them a prospect pact for what happened earlier in the call whenever he pitched, you need to give them a prospect pact for the next call. So at the end of that call on Tuesday, I promise I won't be the person that hammers you with follow-up if we're not a fit. Does that sound fair? So you want to alleviate their fear on the back end, because their number one concern is they go into a demo or they go into knowing about your product and that you're going to send them 80,000 messages afterwards trying to get a hold of them even when they think it's not a fit. So you need to alleviate that and say, again, in review, you need to say, I know I called unannounced. Do you have your calendar handy? They'll say, yeah, I do. Why? I'd say, how does Tuesday at 2 look? They'd say, Tuesday at 2 for what? I'd say, Tuesday at 2, let me say this back to you to make sure that I got it right. Tuesday at 2, make sure I say this back to you so that I got it right. You have a team of 17 reps. You just hired a VP of sales and a director of sales enablement. Linda's your top performer in the team. You don't know what she's saying differently on the phone. You have a few C players, you have B players, and you have A players, which really consists of Linda. And you want to figure out how you can coach all these C players and B players to be exactly what Linda is so that you can overcome quota. Tuesday at 2, I want to hear more about that. I want to hear a little bit more about your team before I go into blackout pitch mode. And if it does make sense, and if we are a fit, then I can tell you a little bit more about outreach and how we can, help your team, turn all of your team into Lindas. And at the end of that call on Tuesday at 2, I promise I won't be the person that just hammers you with follow-up if we're not a fit. The next stage, second to last stage, is I would say, what else? I would ask them to add into the agenda. There's 2 purposes to this piece. And I know it's going to sound a little bit crazy, but there is a very, very high, uncomfortably high no-show rate in the industry. And if I had to guess why, especially on cold calls, historically, the data that I've looked at, especially for the teams that I've run, cold call no-show is more prevalent than email no-show. Because on a cold call, someone might be just trying to appease you by taking a meeting, whereas with an email, they would just not respond if they didn't want to take the meeting. So you're at higher risk for someone not showing up to that appointment that you just set with them. So this second piece is more of a prophylactic case where I'm trying to get them to add things to the agenda. Number 1, because I want to know what they want to know about, but number 2, I want to make some kind of really agreement and pact with them of what's going to happen Tuesday at 2 and what matters to them. So I make sure I cover all my bases, and I also increases the chance that they're going to show up. So I would say, what else? Anything else that you would like to know about? And I would fill in your company expertise. So let's say you sell marketing attribution. So I'd say, what else? What else do you want to know about the campaigns that you're running coming up in Q4? They might give you some things, they might not, but either way, it's a great signal to send to your prospect that you're really interested in what they want to get out of the call, because you're constantly and monomaniacally focused on what value you can deliver to them and what they want out of the agenda, and it's not all about you. And then the last piece of the agenda is you're going to say, great, I'm sending over an invite now. Let me know if there's anything I can do to support in the meantime, and I'm looking forward to Tuesday at 2. So in summary, this is a long session, and I know that cold calls are brutal. I'm not unaware to that fact and that reality. I've been on hundreds and thousands of cold calls, and I've heard people do them, and I've done thousands myself. But I do think that there is an opportunity here. I think if we lean on some structure, and we have a structure that helps us be creative and helps us be, really impactful in the room and helps us give leeway to how the conversation is going, but also that we have tenets and techniques that we stand by, then it makes this cold call a lot less pressure and a lot less like we're selling, more so like we're listening, and more so like we're a student of the game and we want to know more about them. So I think that's a great opportunity, and I'm excited to hear how everyone does on the cold calls moving forward for them. So that's it, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that you're in a much more confident spot after watching this session and ready to crush dials this afternoon. If we did a bronze medal in this session, then go ahead and go to flipthescript.co if you want to see more sales sessions that are just like this one. If we did a silver medal in this session, go to Flip the Script on LinkedIn and give us a follow. And if we got the Michael Phelps gold medal, then go ahead and tag Flip the Script on LinkedIn and your top 2 takeaways so I can see what you like from the session. Hope you have a great rest of your day.